Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Phoebe Bain, and I am the lead writer for Marketing Brew, which is Morning Brew's marketing vertical. So we're really happy to have you here, and we're excited to get started. So for brands, trust matters more than ever before. Trust unlocks new consumer brand relationships and is essential to converting consumers from casual purchasers to brand loyalists and advocates. The job of the CMO and COO is more challenging than ever before as a result. Today's leaders have evolved from pushing product and running ads to carrying the mantle of corporate purpose and building brand trust. The role is challenging, and today we're going to talk about that with leading experts in the field. In particular, the trust between brand and consumer, not simply did you meet my needs, but did you align with my values and do something good for society? That's what matters more than ever before. So research from Edelman shows that trust unlocks new brand-consumer relationships and is essential to converting consumers from casual purchasers to brand loyalists and advocates. So with all of that in mind, please welcome the following people. First, we're going to start off talking to Harvard professor Elie Ofek, and then we're going to have Jen Wong, the COO of Reddit, Carla Hassan, CMO of Citigroup, and Chris Bruzzo, the CMO of EA, join us after we talk with Elie. So first of all, thank you all for being here and participating in this exciting discussion. And second of all, we're excited to see what you have to say. So you are totally welcome to drop any questions into the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, and we'll answer them at the end of the event. As many as we can get to. We know that there were a lot of you RSVP'd. All right, so with all that in mind, Elie, hi, thank you so much for joining us today, and we are super excited to pick your brain.
Great, it's a pleasure to be here, Phoebe. Thanks so much.
Yeah, of course, of course. All right, so let's jump right into it. Okay, so with the shift in marketing over the last 6 months, one of the previous indicators for CMOs was around awareness and promotion. But what do you think it is now with that shift over the past 6 months with our culture changing so rapidly? So like, does trust play a bigger role in an individual's relationship with a brand, and why or why not?
Well, indeed, Phoebe, as you mentioned, things have changed. Consumers, I think the biggest aspect is that consumers are just facing a lot more uncertainty these days. And that uncertainty is on multiple fronts. Obviously linked to some extent to the pandemic. The normal way of life has been upended. Consumers are rethinking how they shop, what they buy, how they buy. There's supposed to be a new normal, but I think we don't even know what that new normal is yet. And consumers are just second guessing almost every aspect of what they do. At the same time, another trend that's been going on in these last few years has been a lot of media questioning. As a consumer, do I believe everything the media puts out there? Do I believe everything companies put out there? So there's a lot of doubt on that front. As well, recent social events have caused consumers also to reconsider to a large extent, how they view themselves in society, how they view various things going on in society. So there's a lot of reconsidering there too. I guess the bottom line is that the world has gotten less scripted, less predictable, less certain, somewhat more chaotic. And so in that context, what we know from a lot of research in the past, both academic and in practice, is that one of the sort of biggest counterforces to this uncertainty is trust. We know that consumers, when facing a lot of uncertainty, will tend to gravitate towards those options which they trust the most. So especially in the context of decision-making and choices, that kind of uncertainty matters. And that's why it's so paramount for brands today to instill trust in consumers. And that becomes a leading indicator for CMOs in terms of how well their brand is doing. And I'll just note that, in the last 6 months, if we look at how much consumers have shifted in terms of what they buy and how they buy, that shift is bigger than what we've ever seen over a 6-month period before. And what we see is that the winners are those companies that have a large level of a good level of trust. They are able to retain customers or acquire new ones. And the losers are those that don't have that level of trust. They are losing their customers or not able to acquire new ones.
That makes sense. So you're a professor at Harvard. You've been doing that for a long time. So you know more than anybody that trust is multifaceted and can represent many different things. So I really want to dig into that trust piece first of all. For brands and CMOs specifically, what exactly is trust? And what have you found in your research is trust? And what role does it play in the business of brands and CMOs? So like, why should brands and CMOs care about trust?
Great set of questions there, Phoebe, and I think big questions. So let's unpack it. We've been using this word trust, but we haven't really defined it. So when you step back a little bit and say, what does trust mean even between any two parties? In effect, what you're talking about is some kind of a belief that you can rely on that other side to keep its promises. You can rely on that other side to act in a way that is consistent with how you want to be treated, not to hide anything from you, and so on. And these elements of trust that I've just talked about, they apply to the relationship that consumers have with brands. And I think as you noted, trust is multifaceted. It's not just one thing. When we think about trust in brands, it has multiple layers. I think the first layer, which was very relevant in the past, still is today, but it was mostly about the product. Can I trust that the product will do what it's supposed to do? Can I trust the product to be safe? Then trust in brands evolved to suggest, does the brand care about me? If something goes wrong, will they be fair towards me? So there was that layer of trust. But I think trust has evolved today to include other layers. And I think some of those we kind of touched on, which are, is the brand aligned with what matters to me? Is the brand aligned with how I see various things going on out there? Does the brand care about the same things that I care and share my values? So I think it's those layers that now constitute trust in a brand, and they're interconnected. So if you can build that credibility as a brand that cares about the things that consumers care about in society, that can spill over to trust in your product and trust in sort of your customer care. And I think the important thing to think about is that trust is not static, it's dynamic. It has past, present, and future in the sense that you build the trust over time by things that you've done. Have you kept your promises, and you portrayed something and you were consistent with that, and you acted in ways that were consistent with what mattered to consumers. It has a present. Are you acting in a way that's consistent with the brand trust that I thought I should put in you? Are my experiences consistent? Are you not abusing the trust? But I think what's important for marketers and why they should care, you asked why they should care, is that brand extends out into the future. So if you build that brand capital, then consumers will stay loyal. They will try your new products. They will sort of not leave you when something else that looks like a shiny new penny comes out. They will stay with you. And even during this pandemic, we've seen a study over study showing that consumers feel that brands that will put profits over people, they will lose their trust. Brands that will put the people over the profits, they stand to gain, consumers' trust, and consumers will stay with them.
Yeah, so all that makes sense in theory, right? That, trust is obviously really important to the consumer, and consumers will stay more loyal if they trust a brand and they trust the brand's values and all of that. But I think that for marketers, it's hard to have like a specific metric for what trust is, because as we said before, it is so multifaceted. So you specifically partnered with Edelman on the journey of developing the Edelman Trust Management for brands. First of all, I guess if you could explain what that is in, one sentence or two. And then I would really like to know personally, just where do you see the ETM's greatest value and impact for marketers?
Absolutely. So indeed, worked with Edelman to think about how to help brands, measure and use some kind of a trust metric. And so what ended up getting developed, which I think is a really useful value for brands, is this Edelman Trust Management for brands. And I think it has a lot of power because it has two levels to it. So one level is a high level of trust, just a general barometer of how well your brand is doing on trust in terms of, do customers trust your brand? It's a very simple kind of question that consumers are answering, but it turns out to be very predictive, and it turns out to have a lot of power in it. And you can benchmark your score on that overall barometer, that overall one high level measure, against your competition. But then what this model does is it breaks down the trust into the drivers of trust. And so it's able to give you diagnosticity into actually what is driving a level of trust that you have. Maybe you have weaknesses on some of those drivers. Maybe you're strong on others. So it gives you, it sheds light for you as a marketer, as a CMO, on what elements of trust you need to work on. And those drivers of trust that were found to be most pertinent to understanding why you have a high or low level of trust are, ability, meaning how good is your product, how functionally competent is it. It relates to another dimension is dependability, which relates to transactions and the fact that you will keep your promises as a brand. It has integrity built in, which is how ethical and moral are you to the different stakeholders. Another element that builds or drives trust is purpose, and that goes to how much you act on societal and value issues that matter to consumers. And lastly, it has the self component, which is about the personal angle of your, being relevant to me as a consumer. And so what value this has, these two layers of the one level score and then the different drivers to help you diagnose, is that it can help you understand also the relationship between trust and various performance measures. So you can link your trust score to whether or not it's enabling you to have consumers give you more willingness to pay, being loyal to you, advocate for you, share their data with you. And in that sense, it's linkable to the customer journey. So it's kind of that level of diagnosticity that I think is of great value to brands today with respect to trust. And also, what matters for trust in one category like insurance might not be the same for another category like laundry detergents or smartphones. And so this model can help you understand in your category what are the drivers of trust and what is important for you to look at.
Well, that's absolutely fascinating. I am just personally wondering, how can the CMO translate that level of trust? And why does it matter and essentially like why that level of trust matters to the CEO and the broader business community after they have that metric, right? Because I feel like marketers can often feel like their side of the business is on an island a little bit. So yeah, how are they able to translate that to the broader business?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's nice for a CMO to have a lot of measures and metrics, but they, at the end of the day, need to make the compelling case that trust matters, and it matters for their brand. So I think at the core, it's starting relating to what I touched on before, which is how do you highlight to the CEO that if you have high trust, if you can build trust, if you can improve the trust your brand has, it will drive business results. And what we've seen in studies, Edelman did these studies, but there are also studies in academia that show that consumers with high level of trust in a brand, that correlates with more willingness to pay and more loyalty and more advocacy for the brand compared to those consumers who indicate that they don't trust your brand or they are neutral to your brand. And it can be as much as 5 to 7 times higher, meaning brand trusters, if I can call those consumers this way, will do these behaviors, these desired behaviors, like 5 to 7 times more than brand distrusters. So I think you can go and make the case to the CEO that, hey, we need more of the brand trusters. And so we need to work on a number of these dimensions that drive trust in order to make that work. And I think that the CMOs can also charge their CEOs with getting involved. And I think some of these drivers of trust will only improve for a brand if they get their CEO involved in being part of the activity, in making the statements, and showing the level of integrity and purpose that the brand wants to convey, and giving the backing of senior leadership.
Wow, well, that is all absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much for taking the time today to explain that to everybody. I do want to move into our broader panel discussion, so feel free to stick around if you want. I'm sure people are going to have questions for you at the end as well. But we're going to go ahead and bring in Chris Bruzzo, the CMO of EA, Jen Wong, the COO of Reddit, Carla Hassan, the CMO of Citigroup, and Edelman US Brand Chair, Michele Anderson. So if everybody could just hop into the screen, we are going to start our discussion off with talking about the shifting role of the CMO that Elie just touched on a little bit there. So I want to start by asking Michele a quick question. Michele, so you work closely with a large number of CMOs. How have you seen the role shift amidst the pandemic? And how has this forced you to think differently about your role in advising them?
Yes, so thank you, Elie. That was huge in terms of trust. But from our perspective, I think even before COVID-19, the role of the CMO was extremely challenging. And depending on where you get your data, I think the last set of data I got was the life expectancy of the average CMO was about 23 months. So it's a very, very difficult task. And I think the bandwidth of responsibilities was extremely broad, and the remit for the CMO also very ill-defined. So we saw a lot of CMOs and CMO roles going away. We saw the two roles converging into one. We saw new roles coming out of the woodwork, like Chief Experience Officer and all sorts of new titles. So the situation does reflect a world where organizations are really grappling with an explosion of channels, technology that's continually changing, reduced resources, talent that perhaps is not ready for the new world that we have right now, and then an ongoing discussion about metrics. So this is the world of the CMO. And the new CMOs that are coming through the organizations, they really sit at the forefront of change, of driving technology, of investment, of customer experience, of new product development, and shaping purpose and values, position and culture for their organizations. So it's an incredibly vulnerable job with multiple linkages. So the CMO speaks to the CFO, he speaks to the CEO, he speaks to the CTO, he speaks to the HR people, he speaks to legal. And a lot of the pressure on performance is put at the feet of the CMO because so many of these worlds are converging where he or she operates. So during this time of COVID, all that's happened is we've taken this very complex situation and just turned up the heat for these CMOs. And what that means is in our world, I can bucket it into various issues that we've had to talk about. So one is operational issues. So during COVID, especially in the beginning, we had issues with demand. So there was, there's a lot of media coverage out there about products being in shortage. So the demand increased, and for a lot of our clients, they couldn't keep step with that demand. So a lot of issue and crisis communication had to go into market around that. Business was also called upon by government to provide PPC, so to take their manufacturing capabilities and to make masks and hand sanitizer and stuff like that. So that also shifted their capabilities into new areas. So a lot of internal employee communications and still issue and crisis management. And then also managing communication on a world stage. So some of these companies suddenly found themselves in a global conversation, watching what was coming out of the White House and trying to square that up with what they were providing in the marketplace. The second piece is health and safety. So we saw from our trust data that there's a general lack of trust amongst, through government and institutions, and people are looking to brands to provide factual information. So getting information about health and safety that people could rely on. Consumers were looking to brands and employers to provide that information and accurately provide it so it could impact on the way people were living their lives. Thirdly was the cultural upheaval. So we've seen with the racial justice movement, that has given voice to millions of Americans and shone a light on the issue of systemic racism. So we saw people in the streets protesting, we saw violence, we saw various issues on the broadcast channels. And almost every CMO that we were working with was asking the questions of, what does this mean to my brand? Your research is telling me that we need to do, not say, like we need to lean into this issue, but how far do we lean in? How far above the parapet do we put our heads? What does our brand really represent at this time? And how do we authentically communicate at this time? And I think a lot of brand strategy was being rethought during this time, especially within these cultural contexts. And that's going to play into the brand strategy going forward for a long time to come. So we had a task force called the Floyd Forward Task Force, which is multicultural experts. They were asked by 400 of our clients to come and give input specifically on this issue. So the trust data has been absolutely crucial during this time. Our special reports on trust said that consumers are expecting brands to not only speak out, but to do. I think 62% of people said that the country would not make it through the crisis without brands playing a critical role. And 63% of people felt that brands were responding more quickly to the pandemic than even government. 90% of them felt that brands should protect the well-being and the financial security of suppliers and employees. And 87% said companies should partner with government to solve the problems. So more recently, the trust data has also said that 65% of consumers said that the way brands respond to the pandemic would, to a large extent, influence the way that they supported the brand going forward in the future. So, you know, it's obvious that trust is at the core, and with all the fall downs in society and with all the complexity, the CMOs have been really leaning heavily into the area of trust.
Wow, thank you so much for explaining all of that to us. I saw we had one question come in earlier that asked what the trust model that Elie was referencing earlier was. It's called the Edelman Trust Management for Brands, so the ETM. And just a reminder to keep asking questions in the Q&A box at the bottom. We are going to be answering them more widely at the end of our panel right now, but I just wanted to make that clear for everybody who might have missed the first couple minutes. So moving on to Carla, you are new to the role of CMO. You previously were Citi's Chief Brand Officer, so I'd love it if you could tell all of us a little bit more about the distinction between the roles, just as historically, at least in my mind, the CMO has been more focused on the business metrics, while the CBO focuses on narrative. But in today's climate, are you seeing those converge? Are you seeing a shift at all? I'm just curious to hear about your experience coming into this role.
Well, I mean, there's a reason that that we consolidated the Chief Brand Officer role and the Chief Marketing Officer role together all into one, because I think, you know, as you think about the world that we live in today, what you do from a brand or a branding perspective is so intrinsically linked to what you do from a business perspective. And so the two just naturally came together. So yes, historically at Citi, they were kind of, you know, they were pulled apart, but we felt like, you know, they needed to be brought together. There's no, you know, there's no one outside of the organization that's saying, oh, there's people at Citi that are responsible for the brand and people at Citi that are responsible for the performance of the business. And they're all, you know, because they're all linked, we felt like it was the right thing to do to just put them into one role. So they all drive performance, they all drive trust. The customer experience needs to have sort of the brand overlay and the brand vision. Performance marketing needs to have a tonality of the brand, and the brand needs to leverage, anything you do on the brand needs to leverage the data and the technology that's available to us to be able to kind of speak to consumers or even our clients in a bespoke way, in a relevant way. So for me, I don't see the distinction between the two, which is why I'm sitting here a couple weeks after we brought those two roles together.
Wow, thank you so much for giving some clarity there. Yeah, I feel like as I cover more and more CMOs and Marketing Brew, they are kind of serving Chief Brand Officer roles as well. Chris, I'd love for you to speak to that seismic shift that we're experiencing in everyday life in terms of how your company has been set up for a digital and virtual experience, how it was set up previously and, you know, how it is now set up. How are you making sure that potential customers are aware of your products without it coming off as opportunistic during a hard moment like this for everybody in the country right now? And then secondly, how have you seen your daily frame of reference shift that way in 2020?
Yeah. Well, I think the earliest days of COVID, this was especially poignant. I would say now we've all kind of come to terms that this is life for a while, and this is going to be a part of our lives. It's a little different, but in the earliest days, you're right. We had to be concerned about not looking to be opportunistic. I mean, really advocating for more gaming time while being stuck at home was not really the right position to take. So what did we do? We kind of got back to first principles. Our very first principles is that play is important. And it, on some level, play is even more important when we're experiencing periods of extreme stress.
Yeah, it's one of the safest things you can do right now too.
Yeah, and it's part of contributes to a quality of life. So so we started there. Play is important, and especially important in times of stress. And then playing with others is social. And as it turns out, video games, in a sheltered in place kind of situation, video games are a relatively easy and fun way to engage socially with others. So we kind of started there, and then we focused on the social aspects, and then we kind of just turned the spotlight onto our players and what they were doing, and all the cool ways that they were, their lives were changing in the midst of COVID, and we gave them opportunities to engage with the athletes that we work with in our EA Sports titles and celebrities and others to do fun things from home. We ran tournaments, we did all kinds of things, and we formed a stay home, play together campaign that really drove most of the early days of COVID, that celebration of taking time to play and playing together. As for how it's changing our reference now, I mean, I think some things have just been accelerated. Video games was moving away from packaged goods as the predominant way, a disc in a box, toward digital downloads for years. Now it's significantly increasing because access to physical retail is compromised. So some things are just happening faster and they're happening more. They were already happening, and other things are new. Like, I would say the most significant new thing in gaming is we've seen a significant expansion of people who play games. This period of time has given people an opportunity to try things they didn't try before. And so we're seeing a massive influx of never seen before humans who are showing up in our games and playing our games for the first time.
Oh my gosh, that's so funny. I can see so many of those examples just playing out in my own life as not even really a person that plays a lot of games. I've become a big Words with Friends gal, and I actually just bought a physical Scrabble board, which finally got delivered to my house, but spent much more time with Words with Friends to begin with. Well, thank you, Chris, for expounding upon that for me. I appreciate it. So Jen, in the idea of the gamer world, Reddit is responsible for a product that caters to CMOs. So how have you personally seen marketers' needs shift, and how is Reddit addressing that?
Yeah, it's they've been evolving, and obviously over the last 6 months there's been a tremendous shift. I think already online communities, and that's our world, have already rapidly filled the need for, IRL connection. And in the last 6 months, I think that disconnection, that sort of in-person interaction's clearly been lacking with quarantine, et cetera. So it's even more important than ever. And we've seen people flock to Reddit to solve like real problems. And what's been stunning is that communities have responded so quickly to very specific changes, like first week of COVID, health information. Second week of quarantine, homeschooling, my stock portfolio, relationships because I'm now stuck at home. Week 3, food, bread. Week 4, haircuts. Like such specific needs that would change. Humor disappeared for 3 weeks. That's pretty severe on Reddit. And then it came back in week 4. And if you're a marketer, you are dying for those insights. That's where we were spending a lot of time with our clients, is to give them very specific insights by community. What are they thinking about? How are they feeling? And therefore, if you're ready to jump back in to have a conversation, who are you going to have a conversation with? Which community? What tone is right? And how do you be context aware? So that was a lot, I think, of what we've seen. And I expect that pace of change and volatility that we've seen between COVID and the movement for social justice will continue, certainly with the election around the corner. I think that kind of volatility is here to stay. So that therefore informs like real-time creative ideas that are context aware with that speed. I'd also say, Reddit is known for its realness. It's what real people think about your products and services. And, I often tell CMOs, like, you may not always love what you hear. You're going to find huge fans and you're going to find the truth, but it is people who really have experienced your product. And it is better for you to know than to not know. And when you're in a position where you have to represent brand purpose and you are trying to build trust, you really do want to know what people really think. And Reddit, our communities are incredibly authentic, and they're incredibly real, and they come from a place of having, real experience. So those are the things that I think are really unique.
Got it. That makes sense. So to speak about that role of trust a little bit more and all of this in our current climate as marketers, Chris, as someone who helped drive brand advocates and who helps drive brand advocates today, what do you think is needed to keep customers coming back in today's specific environment that Jen was expanding upon a little bit more?
Yeah. Well, I think actually for a lot of brands, the total number of brand touch points are starting to dwindle or change anyway, and new ones are opening up, which is interesting. But I do think brand value is constantly at risk, maybe more at risk on a day-to-day basis than it ever has been in history. Like, it can move really, really quickly. So there's no resting on your history or anything like that. And influential voices that are mass, and influential voices that are like one-to-one, and all the levels in between. Reddit's a great example where it's one to many, and that many can be from hundreds to thousands to hundreds of thousands. So that it becomes a huge factor in driving perceptions at a macro level, at a micro level around your brand. So what do we have to do? I mean, I think your brands have to have utility. You have to really understand what problem you're solving. We've always had to understand that, but it's particularly important to be able to clearly articulate what is the problem you're solving, and is it better than the alternative? And then I think the other thing besides utility is relevancy. I think, Elie talked about ability, talked about dependability, but there's also this piece around, are you keeping up with the changing expectations of the people that you serve? And are you able to surprise your customers with the idea that maybe some really intelligent design is happening in your company that surprises them and that they wouldn't be able to articulate, but feels really right about where the product is going? That's the kind of relevancy that's just become more and more important. So if your brand is like stuck in any kind of bureaucracy, if you're having a hard time really being clear about utility or relevancy, you're going to get outmaneuvered really quickly.
Interesting. So Jen, I feel like, Chris was just talking about utility and relevancy, and for Reddit, the utility is all about communicating and connecting with others. But I assume that sometimes there's misinformation shared in that communication, which is kind of the nature of human communication, right? So what do you do to build a sense of trust and community amongst your audience? And how do you think about this on behalf of the advertising partners that you work with from a brand trust perspective?
It's a good question. At our scale, there are always people trying to abuse the system, but we take a very specific and unique approach that is very effective for us. And Reddit's actually known for its trust and authenticity. I think you ask people, and actually research, like after layer of research has shown, people trust Reddit to get information on products and services as much as Amazon and Google ratings, because it's real people who have real experience. I think most people would say Reddit is one of the most authentic places on the internet, and it's real. And that can be unsettling, that can be very honest, but people feel very safe. And there's, I'd say, 4 things that drive that. Number one, and they kind of align with what Elie mentioned before. Number one, we are really transparent about our platform values, right? One of them actually is privacy. We believe privacy is a right. That's why you can go on Reddit and you can be anonymous. And while I think a lot of people might say, oh, anonymity creates bad behavior, it doesn't when it's in the right context and the right governance. So that gets to my second piece, which is our shared governance model. So in our world, while we as Reddit Inc. have a layer of policy and enforcement, our communities are our partner in governance. They share the responsibility for safety. They write rules in every community, and they have moderators who apply those rules. Users vote up, they vote down. The downvote is really important. You give 1 million upvotes, 5 million downvotes, sinks to the bottom. Very, very important. And they are responsible for shared governance. And what happens is they can apply context and nuance to a situation. And then on top of that, we have another layer that's for our client partners and advertisers where they can target, negative target. Now they have inventory type control. Now they have third party adjacency brand safety controls. So they have all layers of control. So that's really the second thing. The third is that, to Elie's point about reliability, we've been around for 15 years, and one of our company principles is evolve. That's one of our values. So we have a bedrock of who we are, but we listen to feedback. And that's allowed us to keep in touch with our community. And the fourth is, as I mentioned before, that anonymity and that commitment to privacy, because if you're able to build trust with your users, that's actually where you're able to build trust such that, you know, the ads perform. Like all the research shows basically, like if a person feels like they're in a space that they trust, they actually have higher trust in the ads, and the ads actually perform better because they're just in a better environment overall.
Interesting. Wow. So Carla, I'm watching you kind of react with your face to these things. I'm sure that in some ways Citi's audience is really different from that of Reddit and EA. And in other ways, they're probably not as different as people might think. So in your opinion, have you seen trust change among your customers? And are there things you're considering doing that you may not have previously done in the new world that we now work in?
Yeah, look, I mean, we much like what both Chris and Jen said, right? Like, you know, going back now, if we can believe it's been almost a year, 7 months or so. I think we were all in the very first phases just of when when coronavirus first hit. We were like, everyone, what is going on? We were all in sort of the, deer in headlights mode. But I think very quickly what happened, and this is actually one of the sources of pride, we have at Citi, and I think in many other companies, is that innovation sped up. But innovation that was actually really relevant to the consumer and to the client, so to our constituents, right? So it was really interesting how silos broke down and how, all these kinds of conversations that maybe had taken 2 years before overnight, were just solved, right? And so I think by doing that, we then started to do things that were very meaningful for our consumers. So first thing we did was really talk about, what they cared about was gratitude and thankfulness for actually the people that were out there on the front lines helping. Very quickly that turned into, after doing a bunch of social listening, people saying, well, what are you doing for the community? So it's great that you're thanking all these people, but what are you doing for them? And so we moved very quickly into, here's what we're doing to the community, but then followed very quickly by the consumer saying, well, now what are you doing for me? And I think Chris talked about this notion of utility, and that it became very, the third phase of it was utility. What are we doing for them? And so we measure trust. We measure all kinds of different measures for the brand. One of them is trust. And actually between March and July, we saw an 11-point increase in our trust. For Citi, which you don't see that on a regular basis. But if I go back to some of the data actually from the Edelman Trust Barometer, when I think about 70% of people saying that it is more important than ever today to actually look at the values of a brand, right? And to consider the values of a brand when purchasing. 40% of people becoming, activists, if you will, and telling their own friends, right? Saying I'm influencing purchases. So when you as a brand can behave in a way that is authentic, that's driving a utility, that's clear to the values that you have as a brand, and deliver products and services that are relevant, it actually becomes a very, it's a very simple equation of trust if you do it consistently. And so, we're very fortunate that all of those things kind of came together for us to get to these trust numbers that we're seeing. But it's not easy, and not everything was a walk in the park, right? Like, I mean, there were days when we all made our mistakes, we all made our missteps. But I think when you have inherent trust built in because you consistently behave a certain way with your consumer, when you do have a hiccup, it's actually okay. But we were able to see, numbers that we haven't seen before in such a short period of time, Again, going back to what Chris said, one, because of utility, two, because of authenticity, and sticking to our values. I mean, even, you know, after the murder of George Floyd came out, everyone was talking about what are we doing for the Black community, and everyone did the right thing, as did we, by the way, which was making donations to organizations. That was wonderful. But for us internally, there was an even broader conversation about why are we only, like, we can't only do that.
Oh,
We
of
have
course,
the
yeah.
ability, as you know, we have the ability as Citi, a global company with 200,000 employees that's been around for over 200 years, to actually make an impact in the community and change systemic racism using our balance sheet. And so when you think about that, like, and how much trust that then garners. So, you know, a week ago, 2 weeks ago, we made a major announcement to you know, around racial equity, and that was, you know, those kinds of things are the things when it's not just a checkbook that you write, but you're using your business for good. Those are the kinds of things I think that increase those trust numbers the way that we've seen. So yeah, we've had some pretty good success there, but I don't want it to just feel like we've always had success. I mean, everyone has hiccups along the way, and you just learn and get better.
Wow. Well, Carla, first of all, I have a book recommendation for you. If you haven't read The Color of Money, I think it should be Citi's next book club book. It's essentially about Black banking and the history of it in the US. But just second of all, Michele, just to close up this conversation on the role of trust specifically, do you think trust will continue to be something brands follow closely, just like a net promoter score? Why or why not?
Yeah, I think the world has changed forever. You know, I think that there's no going back. We're using words. I'm so tired of hearing seismic and unprecedented, but it's become part of our vernacular. You know, consumers have changed the way they live. COVID has forced us to look inward, to really assess what's important to us. It's exposed inadequacies, gaps in our society. It's ignited action, huge action that we can see playing out every night on TV. But our world has also become more polarized than it's ever been before. You could see this in the debate the other night, or the lack of debate the other night. You know, the data shows us that trust in government, trust in media, trust in institutions is at an all-time low. And we know that fake news and lying has become commonplace in our world around us. So, you know, cable news is not news anymore. It's becoming entertainment. And if you're a Democrat, you watch CNN. And if you're a Republican, you watch Fox News. So where is the debate? You know, social media also, to a certain extent, places us in an echo chamber, because we know that the algorithms are feeding us information that we want to hear. So we're getting feedback from like-minded people. So again, there's no intellectual debates happening at a very, very deep level. So the role of trust, in my view, cannot be underestimated based on these factors. So the need for transparency, for objectivity, for authenticity, the words that I've heard from Chris, from Carla, and from Jen, the need for relevance is now more critical than it's ever been before. So we've been working and researching trust for 20 years. And on an intellectual level, I think everyone understands the importance, but what we need to do now is link that trust to business metrics, link that trust to outcomes that change the world, that change the conversation around us. So our job is to continue to report, but to make that that connection much more real. And we spoke about the 5 critical drivers that drive trust at the moment, but looking at that from the point of view of that brand trust score and how we leverage that data. So it's not just getting the data, but it's then using that data to improve our creativity, to improve our campaigns, to make the connection so that if your metric is engagement, we understand how trust plays there. If your metric is to sell more widgets, this is how trust plays in that space, and this is the critical driver that's pushing that. So it's to reimagine how brands earn trust. And there are many tools that allow marketers to interpret consumer behaviors. but none truly help us understand the nuanced and the unique types of actions or commitments or experiences or stories that we need to tell audiences to forge that connection with brands. So the tool shows the power of brands, but it also shows leadership and stakeholders, how trust leads to bottom line sales and that kind of metric. So it's powerful, and it marries the data with the storytelling and the creativity.
That's what marketing really is, right? That data and creativity and storytelling all sandwiched together. So before we get into our audience questions, I have a couple questions for each of you about empowered consumers and the role of employees in 2020 in marketing. So we'll play a fun game. I'm gonna ask each of you a question, and I want you to answer in one sentence or as short of an answer as you can. So just real succinct, what's your gut answer here? So I'm gonna start with Chris, if that's okay. So Chris, gaming is by the definition a consumer-driven space. The product that you sell is driven by entertainment rather than necessity. So where, if at all, have you felt pressure to take a stand on political and social considerations, and how do you see that fitting into the way you do your job in the future?
Yeah, I mean, the first question we ask ourselves is, do we have a standing on that issue? And in many cases, we do, because we make sports games and we make The Sims. And so we waded in a significant way. We brought Colin Kaepernick back to Madden as part of celebrating his contribution and what he stands for. We're bringing more skin tones to The Sims. We've made a lot of moves around gender equality and supporting the LGBTQ community in The Sims. So I think for us, it's just about, do you have a standing in that issue? And if you do, then you need to speak up.
Absolutely, thank you. Jen, at the end of the day, employees can be some of your loudest and most outspoken stakeholders in building a brand. So in your role as COO with a specific focus on culture, how do you think about the evolving relationship between employee trust, advertiser trust, and consumer trust?
Well, they're all connected, and they really cannot be viewed or executed in silos today. In fact, what we aim for is transparency across all arms on as many things as possible. Our company value is actually default open. I mean, you could see this in July when we updated our policy on hateful content. It was very important to our company. It was very important to our advertisers, and it was very important to our moderators and our users and community. And I think more and more, all three of these stakeholders want to understand what's happening in totality in terms of the company.
Thank you. Carla, as a leader, what is your approach to managing all the different parts of the organization that report to you, ultimately delivering campaigns, messaging, et cetera, that drive trust with your core consumer?
So I would probably say 3 words. The first word I would say is empathy. Being able to listen to all different parts of the organization, different functions in the organization, to understand sort of their perspectives, their points of view, where they're coming from as we attack an issue. So empathy, I would say, is number 1. Put yourself in their shoes so that you can see what's going on. The other, I would say, is curiosity. So really understanding, being curious about the business issues that you're trying to solve, putting the consumer at the heart of it, but again, doing that through the lens of each of the different functions. So empathy, curiosity. And the last I'd say is empowerment. That's my job as a leader, to help give the direction and the vision, but then empower the people. And I think if you can, listen to where they come from, if you can be curious about what the issues are to solve, and if you can just empower them to do their best, like let them just go, go get it done, go solve it. I think you get authentic campaigns, you get real campaigns, relevant campaigns across the board, from the top to the bottom of the line and or of the funnel. And I think that and that's, I think, for me where it's been. But it's really about the people and empowering the people.
Wow, beautifully said. Michele, last question, one sentence answer. Trust is multifaceted and can represent many things. So what is expected of brands today as it relates to consumers and employees, and how is that different from before?
Yeah, I mean, I think in one sentence, it's about trust being earned. It's not a one and done. It's not a quick fix. It's something that you build over time. So it's really important for marketers to understand their brand intrinsically, what it represents, the values that it holds, and where it can enter the conversation. And then it's about actually doing, not just saying. So it's all very well to put a message out there that resonates or to get yourself into a conversation because it's, you know, timely. But at the end of the day, the consumer is savvy and more savvy than they've ever been before. So if you're going to lean in, be authentic, but also get your house in order, bring your employees along with you, use them as a sounding board when you're looking at your brand campaigns and your brand strategy going forward, and earn that trust over time with every single audience.
Got it. So we are going to go ahead and move into our broader Q&A now. And I will just start with the first question from an anonymous attendee, which is, and anybody can answer these out of all of y'all. So what is your take on the holiday season this year? Will brands lean into the holidays even more? Typically there's a quieter time around the holidays, but will we miss that this year?
Going to be interesting. I don't think we know, other than physical retail traffic is going to be challenged significantly, and especially in Europe, where there's a little more of a reliance on physical retail, at least in the video game category. But I think all physical products are going to be really interestingly negatively challenged by the lack of retail traffic.
You know,
Yeah, we just, oh, go ahead, Carla.
No, go ahead, Jen.
I would, you know, just from our vantage point, other than the obvious ones like physical retail or travel because of the continuing COVID situation, we're actually seeing an incredible amount of activity, an extraordinary amount of activity in the second half this year into Q4. Now, what happens with the election and COVID and whether there are fits and starts and things that change along the way, who knows? That, you know, last 6 months has been volatile like that. But in general, the trend has been toward significant momentum increasing what we've seen in activity from marketers.
Yeah, I think, you know, what we're seeing is very similar, Jen, to what you're talking about. Travel clearly has taken a hit from a purchasing standpoint, but there are other things, so many other things, in addition to the necessities that actually we're seeing quite an uptick on, right? People are home. They're doing a lot more home improvements. They're caring a lot more about what home looks like. So I actually think you're going to see people in their small bubbles, but I think you're going to see people, whether it's a small family gathering or people that are, you know, safe together, I think are going to, I think there'll still be some activity in holiday. I think it'll be much more homey, certainly, but I think the one thing that we don't know is exactly what Jen said, which is what comes out of November 3rd, what happens on November 4th. That could, and then if there's an, you know, increase on the COVID front or spikes or whatever, we just don't know. But so far, I think, you know, we're starting to see people, you know, continue, you know, they're buying, they're just not going on trips, which are the bulk of what people, you know, spend their money on. But, you know, I think it'll be very interesting to tell. I just don't think anyone knows right now.
Yeah, that makes sense. So next question comes from Polo. How do you balance standing up too much for beliefs when you know a portion of your client base will react negatively?
Can I take that one actually?
Yeah,
because
go for it.
we've just gone through this so many for the last, you know, couple of years actually at Citi since I've been there. So, you know, gosh, January of 2019, what are we in January 2019, our CEO, Mike Corbett, was at Davos, and he was talking to CNBC, and we had just launched publicly announced our pay equity gap, our median pay equity gap between men and women at Citi. And the numbers weren't great. And in fact, he said the numbers aren't great. And there's a whole host of people out there that really believe that there's no pay equity issue. They actually really do believe that it's all good You know, it's all good. And so he announced that in January, and then come, you know, towards almost the end of the year, I had said, you know, I think we should talk about this publicly. I think this is a game changer for us. I think that, you know, no one else really is talking about it publicly. And, you know, this median number is something that people haven't really talked about. So maybe we can, you know, bring some, we can bring it to the forefront as an issue. And, you know, there wasn't necessarily a lot of conversation, but there was definitely this notion that we're going to come out and say something, and are we going to push people to, you know, to think differently, and is that going to be okay, and are people going to be mad at us? And ultimately we went out and did it. We had a beautiful campaign around it called The Moment. But interestingly enough, with that, what it ended up doing is it ended up people we had more people coming to Citi to want to work at Citi, saying, hey, we see that you guys believe in, because we had talked about it, we see that you guys believe in, you know, in this topic, and we actually think that of all the places we want to go work, Citi is the place, because we know that you guys believe in it. So I think, you know, that's one of many examples. I could give you the racial equity example as well, because we just did something there. We launched 2 ads on national television, which is a big deal for us as a financial institution, you know, to use words like Black Lives Matter, right? When you know that there's so many people in our client base that, you know, may not be on that same, you know, same side. But for us, I think what was really important, this is a long-winded way of saying what I think was really important to answer that question, is as long as it is in your values and your belief systems as an organization, you have to be willing to take that hit. You have to be. If you care about it, you have to be. Whether it's on LGBTQ plus issues, whether it's on commercial firearms policy that we changed at Citi, whether it's on pay equity or on race, like these are conversations we have to have, but only if they're consistent with your values as an organization. If they're not, Michele is right. Consumers are going to sniff it out. So when you can't come and, you know, show a sustainability, you know, a commitment for the next 5 years if you haven't been showing a sustainability commitment for the last 15, right? Those are the kinds of things I think you shouldn't be afraid if it's in your values. So hopefully that helps contextualize it a little bit.
Yeah, just a quick follow-up question from my own curiosity. You said that like you have to be able to take that hit, right? Because you have to be consistent with your brand values, and that's what generates trust, right? How big is the hit? Not just for Citi, but for brands in general that do this.
We don't know. I don't think you know, Phoebe. So when we you know, rewrote our commercial firearms policy, we thought that, you know, it's a couple years ago now, we thought that for sure we were going to lose a ton of business. But you know what, we lost some. Certainly some people were saying, you know, we don't agree with what you've done here, but on the balance, we gained more. And so, you know, but I don't think you'll ever know, right? I don't think you'll ever know. But again, that's why you just have to, it has to be consistent with your values. If it's not, then you're going to be more afraid to lose a lot, if that makes sense.
That totally makes sense. Thanks for answering that follow-up.
I also think that you have to take sort of a long view. It's also, you know, when you're thinking about building trust over time, if you think about building a brand over many, many years or even decades, you know, you can't just be knee-jerk in this reaction. And what might happen is you get a dip in sales immediately because it's a hot topic. It's, you know, it's big in terms of media coverage and all the rest of it. But what we found with some of our brands is there's an immediate hit, but then there's a slow climb again. And what we don't know is whether the slow climb is happening because the loyalists are becoming even more loyal and perhaps buying more, being even more loyal to the brand, or whether those that went away are slowly coming back. So, you know, it's a very dynamic ecosystem that you're dealing with, but our advice to a lot of our clients is to take a long view, to be committed to those values that Carla was talking about, and to ride through the difficult patches to a better future.
I'll go ahead and ask one more question before we wrap it up, and per usual, anybody can take it. But Jane asked, do you need to own a driver of trust? How do you make your brand stand apart from other brands in your same category? Does it just come down to who does it better?
I don't know what it means to own a driver of trust, but I think those 5 things that are in the Edelman Trust Matrix are I can't remember what the M stands for, are good. ability, dependability, integrity, purpose, and self. And I think you have to have a really good understanding of how you're doing across all of those things, and acknowledge that you're not always going to get it right. I mean, in video gaming, it's almost impossible to get it right every time. And that requires then a fortitude to come back and make corrections and improve and learn and adjust. And then that in and of itself becomes a trust building exercise. So
That makes sense. Jen, did you want to respond to that one as well?
Yeah, I was going to say that, it's not a monolith and people are not a monolith. I think, again, I always take a community lens to it because I think people, like, context really matters, who you're talking to, and having a dialogue where you really understand the values of the different communities that you are trying to join and be a part of. And they all have different values and mores and things that are acceptable and things that aren't, and how you show up. And I think that's what really matters. I mean, I think that, there are different ways that I think brands execute the different aspects of trust, but in the end, their values can be different. But so long as it's really clear how those values translate into, like, a specific community, you have to really make sure that it is context aware when delivered. I think that's what really cuts through in the end. Like, you and another company may have the same set of values, but the execution of how you communicate them and how you humanize what you do and how you actually relate to that community, it makes all the difference.
Thank you so much, Jen. And thank you so much to everybody who was willing to come and participate in our, little chat today. Michelle, Chris, Jen, Elie, Carla, thank you so much for your time and giving all of your insights to these hundreds of people that we have in the audience. It was, really exciting to hear from all of you. So yeah, thank you so much. And, in terms of closing out, I think that if marketers have learned anything in 2020, it's that trust truly does matter now more than ever for not only brand safety, but to attract new customers and, to keep your remaining customers coming back, whether you're a B2C brand or a B2B brand. So yeah, thank you so much again to all of our guests and to all of you who joined. And I hope that you found this conversation both informative and inspiring.
Thanks.